The Iron Nebula was the kind of place where trouble walked through the door every night. And tonight was no different. Elena Vargas wiped down the counter with a rag that had seen better days, and looked up at the entrance as the heavy blast doors slid open with a groan that shook the walls. The sound alone made half the tavern go quiet, and the other half followed when they saw what stepped inside. 5 Dracarin, each one taller than any creature Elena had ever served, each one covered in scales that shimmered like liquid metal under the dim lights of the bar. Their bodies were massive, their wings folded tight against their backs like cloaks made of living shadow, and across every inch of their exposed skin there burned strange glowing marks, tattoos that pulsed with light, shifting between deep orange and blinding white, like embers that refused to die. He had to duck his enormous horned head just to fit through the doorway, and the floor cracked beneath his clawed feet as he walked. His left eye was gone, replaced by a scar that ran from his brow down to his jaw like a river carved through stone. And across his chest there burned the brightest sigil of them all, a spiraling mark of fire and starlight that seemed to move and breathe on its own. Every single patron in the tavern looked away. Some stood up and left without finishing their drinks, and the ones who stayed pressed themselves against the far walls as if trying to become part of the furniture. Even the other servers, a mix of tall insectoid Creely and four-armed Palashi, refused to go near the table the 5 dragons chose in the back corner. Elena watched all of this from behind the counter and felt her heart beating hard inside her chest. But her hands stayed steady and her face stayed calm. She had been working at the Iron Nebula for 2 years now, and she had served warlords, smugglers, fugitives, and once a general who was wanted for burning an entire moon. 5 dragons were not going to make her hide behind a counter. She picked up a tray, loaded it with the strongest drinks on the menu, and walked straight toward them. The tavern watched her, like she was walking into the mouth of a furnace. The eldest dragon, Corvathus, though she did not know his name yet, noticed her approach before the others did. His single remaining eye tracked her with the kind of focus that a predator gives to something it has not yet decided to eat. The other 4 Dracarin shifted in their seats, and one of them let out a low rumbling growl that Elena felt in her teeth more than she heard with her ears. She set the tray down on the table without a word, placed each drink in front of each dragon with steady hands, and then straightened up and met Corvathus's gaze directly, which she would later learn was something most species considered either very brave or very stupid. Corvathus tilted his massive head and studied her the way someone might study an insect that had just lifted a stone 1,000 times its own weight. "You are not afraid," he said, and his voice was deep enough to rattle the glasses on the tray. It was not a question. "I am afraid," Elena answered honestly. "I am just also very busy, and fear does not pay my rent." Something shifted in the old dragon's face. Not a smile, because Dracarin did not smile the way humans did, but something close. A flicker of what might have been amusement, or perhaps respect. The other 4 Dracarin exchanged glances, but said nothing. Elena turned to leave, and as she did, her sleeve caught on the edge of the tray and rode up her arm. The worn photograph she kept pinned inside her apron shifted and became visible for just a moment. A small, creased image of a woman with dark hair and fierce eyes, and a mark on her shoulder that glowed even in the photograph. Corvathus saw it. His entire body went rigid. The bioluminescent sigils across his skin flared so bright that the nearest patron yelped and shielded their eyes. The other 4 Dracarin noticed their elder's reaction and immediately tensed, their claws scraping against the metal table with a sound like knives on stone. Elena did not notice. She had already moved on to the next table, and the noise of the tavern, what little of it remained, covered the sound of 5 dragons holding their breath. She made her rounds, cleared glasses, took orders from the few patrons brave enough to stay, and eventually circled back to the Dracarin table to collect the empty vessels. The dragons had not spoken a word since she left. They had simply sat in silence, watching her move through the room with the patient intensity of hunters. As she reached for the last glass, her eyes fell on the glowing sigil that spiraled across Corvathis's forearm, and she stopped. Her hand hung in the air, her breath caught. Her eyes widened, not with fear, but with something deeper and older and far more personal. She recognized that mark. She had seen it every single day of her childhood, burned into the shoulder of the woman who had raised her, who had sung to her, who had taught her to never look away from anything, no matter how big or how terrifying it was. "My mother carries the same tattoo as you," she said, and her voice was quiet, but it carried through the silence like a bell. Every Dracarin at the table went completely still, not the stillness of calm, but the stillness of something ancient being shaken to its very core. Corvathis leaned forward, and the table groaned under his weight. His single eye burned with a light that was not just bioluminescence. It was something raw and deep, and full of a pain that had been buried for decades. "That is not possible," he said, and his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper, which somehow made it more terrifying than when he had spoken at full volume. "No human has ever borne our mark. To claim otherwise is a death sentence under the oldest laws of my kind." Elena did not step back. She did not flinch. She reached into her apron and pulled out the photograph, and placed it flat on the table between them. The image showed a woman, older, scarred, with eyes that burned with the same steady fire that Elena carried in her own. And on her shoulder, clear as daylight, and impossible to deny, there glowed a perfect Ashbourne sigil, identical in every detail to the one on Corvathis's chest. The old dragon stared at the photograph, and for the first time in what might have been centuries, his claws trembled. He whispered a name that he had not spoken in over 40 years, a name that tasted like smoke and grief, and something that might have been love. Maria. Elena felt the ground shift beneath her feet, not literally, but in the way that a person's entire world shifts when they realize that the story they thought they knew was only the beginning. Corvathis looked up from the photograph, and his eye glistened with something that Elena had never expected to see. On the face of a creature that could burn cities to ash. "Sit down, child," he said. "I need to tell you about your mother." And in that moment, in a run-down tavern at the edge of dying space, a human waitress sat down at a table with 5 dragons, and the galaxy began to change. The other 4 Dracarin shifted uncomfortably when Elena sat down at their table, and one of them, a younger dragon with deep blue scales and sharp golden eyes, let out a low hiss of disapproval that vibrated through the metal surface between them. Corvathis silenced him with a single look. It was the kind of look that did not need words, the kind that carried the weight of centuries of authority and battle and loss. And the younger dragon lowered his head and said nothing more. Elena sat with her hands folded on the table, the photograph of her mother still resting between them like a bridge between 2 worlds that were never supposed to touch. She could feel the heat radiating from the Dracarin bodies around her. Not just warmth, but real heat, the kind that made the air shimmer and her skin prickle. 42 years ago, Corvathis began, and his voice had changed. It was no longer the deep rumble of a warrior giving commands. It was the voice of an old soldier, remembering something he had tried very hard to forget. "My warriors and I were sent to a colony world called Kethara 9 to put down an insurgency that had been growing in the outer territories." He paused and looked at the photograph again, and Elena saw something flicker behind his single eye, a memory playing out like a fire that had never fully gone cold. "We were the Ashbourne, the most feared force in the galaxy. We had never been defeated, never been ambushed, never been made to feel what it was like to be helpless. And then, Cathara 9 happened. The insurgents had been waiting for them. They had developed a bioweapon, a nerve toxin engineered specifically to target Dracaran biology. It attacked their fire glands and shut them down one by one, turning the warrior's greatest weapon into a source of agonizing pain. Worse still, the toxin made their bioluminescent tattoos glow brighter and brighter, turning the proud marks of the Ashborn into beacons that the enemy could track through smoke and darkness and rubble. Dozens of Ashborn fell in the first hours. Warriors who had survived 100 battles collapsed in the streets of a burning colony, their bodies betraying them, their fire going dark for the first time in their lives. Corvathis was among the fallen. The toxin hit him hard, and his vision went black as his remaining eye swelled shut. He felt his fire glands seize and his sigils burn with a terrible brightness that he could not control. He collapsed in the wreckage of a downed transport ship and lay there in the smoke and the ash, waiting for death with the grim patience of a soldier who had always known it would come eventually. Death did not come. Instead, a pair of small hands grabbed him by the edge of his chest plate and pulled. He remembered the sensation clearly, even after all these years, the absurd, almost laughable feeling of something tiny and fragile trying to drag his 7-ton body across broken ground. He remembered thinking that he must be hallucinating, that the toxin was making him imagine things, because nothing human-sized could possibly be foolish enough to try. But the hands did not stop pulling, and slowly, impossibly, he began to move. Maria Vargas was 23 years old when she found Corvathis. She was a field medic with the 4th Human Expeditionary Relief Corps, a volunteer unit that most species in the galaxy considered either noble or insane, and usually both. Humans were not warriors by galactic standards. They were small, soft, short-lived creatures who had only been part of the wider galaxy for a few centuries. Nobody expected anything from them, and nobody asked anything of them. Maria did not care what anybody expected. She dragged Corvathis 2 kilometers through enemy-held territory. She used a makeshift harness built from cargo straps and her own torn uniform, and she pulled him through rubble and fire and gunfire with a strength that should not have been possible for a body that weighed less than one of his claws. She stopped twice, once to fight off a scout with nothing but a broken metal rod, and once to shield his body with her own, when an explosion sent debris raining down on them both. When she finally got him to safety behind a collapsed wall, she went to work. She had no equipment designed for Dracaran anatomy, no training in alien medicine, and no idea what she was doing. But she had a broken datapad with a partial medical database, a kit full of human supplies, and a refusal to let anyone die on her watch that burned hotter than any fire the Dracaran had ever known. She worked for 11 straight hours. She synthesized an antitoxin from battlefield chemicals and her own medical supplies, testing each compound on small patches of his skin and watching for reactions. She cut into tissue she had never seen before, repaired glands she could not name, and stitched wounds that were wider than her entire arm span. She did all of this while enemy fire cracked against the walls around her, and dust fell from the ceiling like gray snow. Corvathis survived. When his eye finally opened, and he saw the tiny human woman slumped against his side, covered in his blood and her own sweat, unconscious from exhaustion, something inside him shifted in a way that no battle had ever caused. But Maria did not stop at saving him. Over the following weeks, as Corvathis recovered and the remaining Ashborn regrouped, she stayed with them. She learned their language, not the polite diplomatic version, but the raw battle cant that they used in the field. She learned their signals, their tactics, their formations. She fought beside them in 7 separate engagements, each one more desperate than the last. She was not strong enough to match a Dracarin in combat. She was not fast enough, not tough enough, not big enough. But she was smart in ways that the dragons were not. She could fit into spaces they could not reach, see patterns they could not notice, and think in ways that their ancient warrior traditions had never considered. She hacked enemy communications, set traps, treated the wounded, both human and Dracarin, and once killed an insurgent commander twice her size with nothing but a sharpened piece of debris and a refusal to die. The surviving Ashborn began to call her something in their oldest tongue, Ifkari, which meant one who burns without flame. It was a word from their most ancient stories, a myth about a soul born without fire who carried it anyway. And they whispered it with a reverence that surprised even themselves. When the siege of Kethera 9 finally broke, and the surviving Ashborn gathered in the ruins of the colony to honor their dead, Corvathis made a decision that broke every law his kind had ever written. He tattooed Maria with the Ashborn sigil. He pressed the living ink into her shoulder himself, and the mark took hold the way it always did, burning bright, spiraling with light, becoming part of her in a way that could never be undone. The other survivors watched in silence, and not one of them objected. This human woman had earned it in blood and fire, and 11 hours of surgery performed with shaking hands and a broken datapad. The Dracarin High Council was furious. They demanded the sigil be removed, by force if necessary. They said it was an abomination, a violation of sacred tradition, an insult to every Ashborn who had ever lived. Corvathis and the surviving Ashborn of Kethera 9 stood together and told the council that anyone who touched Maria would have to go through them first. The council backed down, the records were sealed, the story was buried, and Maria Vargas became a ghost, a name that the Dracarin whispered among themselves but never spoke aloud to the rest of the galaxy. Corvathis finished his story, and the tavern was so quiet that Elena could hear the hum of the station's life support systems, 3 decks above them. His single eye found hers, and she saw in it a grief so vast and so old that it made her chest ache. "Your mother saved the Ashborn," he said. "She saved me, and I have not seen her in 37 years. His voice cracked, actually cracked, like stone splitting under pressure, and he asked the question that Elena had been waiting for. "Tell me, child, where is Maria now?" Elena's jaw tightened. Her eyes glistened, but did not overflow. Her voice was steady and hard, and carried the same iron that her mother had carried through the fires of Kethera 9. "She is in a detention camp on Viros 3, Elena said. "She has been there for 6 years. The Thessari Compact arrested her on false charges and locked her away, and no one in this entire galaxy has done a single thing to free her." The 5 Dracarin went still, and then their sigils ignited all at once, blazing with a furious white light that turned the entire tavern bright as a sun. Corvathis rose to his full height, and the ceiling cracked above his horns, and his voice came out as something between a growl and a roar that made every glass in the building shatter. "Then the galaxy has made a terrible mistake." Within the hour, Corvathis stood in the back room of the Iron Nebula, with his clawed hand pressed against a communications panel that had not been designed for someone his size. The screen flickered and cracked under the heat of his palm, but the signal held, and the face that appeared on the other end belonged to a Dracarin so ancient that her scales had turned from silver to almost pure white. This was Valith, the Grand Matriarch of the Dracarin High Council, the oldest living member of their species, and the only authority in the galaxy that Corvathis answered to. "You are using a priority war channel," Valith said, and her voice was the sound of deep water moving over stone. "This channel has not been activated in 41 years. Explain yourself, Corvathis." "I am invoking the right of Ithkari," he said, and the words fell between them like a blade dropping onto a table. Veylet's white eyes widened, just slightly, just enough for Corvathis to see, and then she was silent for a very long time. The rite of Ithkari was older than their current civilization, older than their written laws, older than the council itself. It was a sacred oath, carved into the foundation of what it meant to be Ashborn. If one who bears the mark is in danger, the entire order must rise to defend them, no matter the cost, no matter the enemy, no matter the consequences. The human woman, Veylet said. It was not a question. Her name is Maria Vargas, and she has been held in a Thessari detention camp for 6 years without trial, Corvathis said. She bears the Ashborn sigil, a mark that we gave her that she earned with her blood in her hands and her impossible human stubbornness. We do not abandon our own. She is not our own, one of the council members said from off-screen, a sharp, cold voice that carried the tone of someone who had been saying the same thing for 4 decades. She is, Corvathis said, and his voice dropped to a register that made the communication panel vibrate. She was marked by the survivors of Kethera 9. She was marked by me, and every one of us who stood in that ruin and watched her bleed for our kind knew exactly what we were doing. You sealed the records, matriarch. You buried the story, but you did not erase the mark, because the mark cannot be erased. It is alive, it is permanent, and it calls to us even now. The silence stretched. Elena stood in the doorway behind Corvathis, watching this exchange with wide eyes and a hammering heart. She understood only fragments of the Dracoran language, but she understood the tone, the weight of power and tradition and ancient law being bent by the will of one old, scarred dragon who refused to forget. Veylet closed her eyes. When she opened them, there was something in them that looked almost like shame. I will authorize a diplomatic intervention, she said. 300 ships, full Ashborn complement. You will lead them, Corvathis. Bring her home. The channel went dark, and Corvathis turned to look at Elena with his single burning eye. It is done, he said. We leave within the hour. Word traveled fast on a space station. It always did. Rumors moved through the Iron Nebula's corridors like electricity through water, and within 30 minutes, every soul on the station knew what had happened. A human waitress had walked up to a table of Dracoran, told them her mother bore their sacred mark, and the dragons had activated their war fleet for the first time in decades. The reactions were immediate and varied. The Kraly bartender locked himself in the supply closet and refused to come out. A Thessary merchant on the upper deck packed his bags and fled to his ship so fast that he left half his cargo behind. A group of Palashi traders gathered in the main corridor and argued loudly about what this meant for interstellar shipping routes. But among the humans on the station, the dock workers, the engineers, the medics, the cooks, the mechanics, the pilots who flew battered cargo ships between forgotten colonies, the reaction was something else entirely. It was quiet at first, a look exchanged between 2 workers on the loading dock, a nod between strangers in the corridor, a hand placed on a shoulder in the mess hall. It was the kind of silence that comes before something shifts, the held breath before a wave breaks. Elena was packing a small bag in her quarters when the first message arrived on her personal comm. It was from a human cargo pilot she had served drinks to 100 times. A woman named Reyes, who flew a beat-up freighter called the Santa Maria, and who always tipped well and never caused trouble. Heard what happened, the message read. Tell me where, and I will be there. The second message came 30 seconds later, from a retired combat engineer named Okafor, who lived 3 decks down. Then a third, from a pair of human mechanics who ran a repair shop on the station's outer ring. Then a fourth and a fifth and a sixth, and within an hour, Elena's comm was overflowing with messages from humans she knew and humans she had never met, all of them saying the same thing in different words. We are coming with you. Elena stood in her tiny room and stared at the screen, and felt something rise in her chest that she could not name. Something that was not quite pride, and not quite grief, and not quite hope, but something made of all three tangled together, like roots beneath the ground. She went to Corvathis and showed him the messages. The old dragon read them in silence, his single eye moving slowly across the screen. And when he finished, he made a sound deep in his throat that Elena had never heard before. A low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through her bones. "Your people," he said, and there was wonder in his voice. "They do not even know your mother. They do not know what she did. They only know that one of their own is caged, and they are willing to fly into the teeth of a war to bring her home." "That is what humans do," Elena said. Corvathis looked at her for a long moment, and then he nodded, slowly, deeply, with the gravity of someone who had just been reminded of something he should never have forgotten. The Dracarin fleet assembled in the darkness beyond the station. 300 warships, each one massive enough to blot out the stars, their hulls glowing with the same living sigils that marked the bodies of their crews. They moved into formation with the silent precision of a species that had been waging war since before most civilizations had learned to make fire. And behind them, in a ragged, uneven line that stretched across the void like a trail of stubborn sparks following a bonfire, came the human ships. They were cargo haulers and medical frigates and transport shuttles and mining vessels, and one ship that was literally held together with welded scrap metal and hope. They had no matching paint, no unified banners, no military coordination. They were a mess, a patchwork, a floating junkyard of determination. But there were hundreds of them, and more were arriving every hour, dropping out of hyperspace in ones and twos and tens, each one crewed by humans who had heard the call and had come. A Thessari diplomat managed to contact the Iron Nebula before the fleet departed. The communication was patched through to the station's main channel, and the diplomat's face was tight with barely controlled fury. "Any hostile action against Viros 3 will be considered an act of war against the Thessari Compact and its allies," the diplomat said. "Identify the individual responsible for this provocation." There was a pause, and then Elena stepped in front of the comm screen. She was still wearing her waitress apron. She had not had time to change. The diplomat looked at her and sneered. "Who are you supposed to be?" Elena looked back at him with her mother's eyes, dark, steady, and burning with something that the Thessari had never understood and never would. "I am the daughter of the woman you have been starving in a cell for 6 years, she said. "And I just told the dragons." She cut the channel. The fleet moved toward Viros 3, and the galaxy watched with the kind of breathless attention that only comes when something truly unprecedented is about to happen. 300 Dracarin warships and a swarm of human junk ships flying side by side into contested space, united by a photograph of a scarred woman with a glowing mark on her shoulder, and a daughter who refused to be afraid. The Thessari defense fleet above Viros 3 consisted of 120 warships arranged in a tight defensive formation around the planet. Sleek, angular vessels bristling with weapons designed to punch through heavy armor at long range. They were a formidable force by any measure, enough to deter most aggressors, enough to hold their own against a standard military incursion. They were not enough for 300 Dracoran warships. The Thessari admiral in charge of the defense fleet, a tall, thin-limbed officer named Serethi, stood on her command bridge and watched the Dracoran fleet drop out of hyperspace on her tactical display. Each ship appeared as a glowing red marker on the screen, and as the markers multiplied, 50, 100, 200, 300, the bridge grew very quiet. Then the human ships appeared behind them, and the tactical display became a scattered cloud of smaller markers, too many to count easily, spreading across the void like seeds thrown by a careless hand. Sarethi's first officer turned to her, with a face that had gone pale beneath his gray skin. "Orders, Admiral?" Sarethi stared at the display and said nothing for a long time. She had been a military officer for 30 years, and she had never seen anything like this, not because of the Dracarin, whose power was well known, but because of the humans. Nobody had ever seen humans mobilize like this. Nobody had ever thought they could. "Open a channel to our allies," she said finally. "Tell them we need reinforcements." The allies did not send reinforcements. What the allies sent, in the hours that followed, were carefully worded messages of regret, explaining that they had reconsidered their position and would not be able to provide military support at this time. One by one, the species that had stood beside the Thesari Compact for decades quietly stepped backward and pretended they had never been involved. The reason for this sudden change of heart was playing on every screen and every channel in the galaxy. Elena had given Corvathis the idea during the journey to Viros 3. She had been sitting in the massive war room of his flagship, a space designed for Dracarin bodies that made her feel like a child in a cathedral. And she had asked him a simple question. "The records from Cathara 9. Do they include battlefield recordings?" Corvathis had looked at her with a spark of understanding and had immediately ordered the records unsealed. The footage was 42 years old, captured by Dracaron combat sensors and human helmet cameras. And it showed everything. The ambush, the poison, the fall of the Ashborn warriors, and then the impossible sight of a young human woman dragging a 7-ton dragon through 2 kilometers of hell with nothing but cargo straps and the kind of determination that made no logical sense. It showed Maria cutting into alien flesh she had never studied, working by the light of her own datapad while explosions shook the walls around her. It showed her standing over Corvathis's unconscious body with a metal rod in her hand, facing down an enemy soldier 3 times her size, and refusing to move. It showed her weeks later, fighting alongside the Ashborn, covered in dust and blood, shouting in their battle language with an accent so terrible that the dragons around her winced, but following her orders anyway, because she was right, and they knew it. Elena broadcast all of it, on every open channel she could reach. The galaxy watched. They watched a species they had dismissed as soft and fragile and unimportant, refuse to let a dying stranger die. They watched a woman the size of a Dracoran's hand perform surgery for 11 hours under fire, because she simply would not accept any other outcome. They watched humans bleed beside dragons and earn a mark that no outsider had ever earned, not through strength or fire or ancient bloodlines, but through the raw, stubborn, unreasonable refusal to give up. The footage changed the shape of the conversation. Suddenly, the Thesari Compact was not defending a legitimate detention. They were holding a war hero, a woman who had saved lives, a woman who had been marked by the most feared warriors in the galaxy. And the humans had not come to start a war. They had come to bring their mother home. The Compact's allies withdrew, their diplomatic support crumbled, and Admiral Sarethi stood on her bridge, watching her tactical advantage disappear with every hour that passed. Corvathis opened a direct channel to the defense fleet. "You have 1 standard hour," he said, and his voice carried across the void with the calm certainty of someone who had never made a threat he did not intend to keep. "Release Maria Vargas, or the Ashborn will come and get her. This is not a negotiation." The Thesari Compact refused. They believed even now that the Dracoran would not risk a full military engagement over a single human prisoner. They believed that politics would prevail, that cooler heads would step in, that someone would blink. Nobody blinked. When the hour expired, Corvathis assembled a strike team of 12 Ashborn warriors in the drop bay of his flagship, the finest soldiers his species had ever produced, each one a living weapon wrapped in scales and fire and ancient training. Elena was waiting for them at the drop bay door, wearing a borrowed tactical suit that was 5 sizes too big, and a look on her face that Corvathis recognized immediately. It was the same look her mother had worn 42 years ago, the look of someone who was going whether you wanted them to or not. "No," Corvathis said. "She is my mother," Elena said. "It is too dangerous. You are not trained for combat. You will slow us down." Elena looked up at him. She had to crane her neck to meet his eye, and the difference in their sizes was almost comical. And she said nothing. She just looked at him with those dark, steady eyes that burned with the same fire that had pulled him from the wreckage of Kethera 9. Corvathis stared back at her, and for just a moment he was not looking at Elena. He was looking at Maria, young and fierce and impossible to argue with. "Get in the ship," he growled. The strike team hit the surface of Viros 3 like a falling star. The Ashborn warriors tore through the outer defenses of the detention facility with a speed and ferocity that left the Thessari guards scrambling. Walls melted under dragon fire, blast doors were ripped from their hinges by clawed hands, and the sound of Drakerin war cries echoed through corridors that had never heard anything louder than the shuffle of prisoners' feet. But the facility had been built by humans, contracted out decades ago to a human engineering firm. The massive Drakerin warriors could barely fit, and in several places they could not fit at all. They jammed in doorways, cracked walls with their wings, and struggled to navigate the tight winding passages that led to the deeper cells. Elena went where they could not. She was small and fast, and she knew human architecture in a way that dragons never would. She crawled through ventilation shafts, hacked security terminals with skills she had picked up from years of fixing broken systems on the Iron Nebula, and opened locked doors from the inside, while 12 frustrated dragons waited in corridors too small for their bodies. She found the cell at the end of a long, dim hallway on the lowest level of the facility. The door was heavy steel with a small window at eye level, and through that window she saw a woman sitting on a thin cot in a room barely large enough to stand in. The woman was thin, thinner than Elena remembered. Her hair had gone gray, and her face was lined with years of confinement and poor food and the slow erosion of hope. But her eyes were exactly the same, dark, fierce, burning with something that 6 years in a cage had not been able to extinguish. Elena's hands shook as she worked the lock. The mechanism clicked, the door swung open, and mother and daughter stood face to face for the first time in 6 years. Maria looked at Elena, and something in her face broke open. All the walls she had built to survive, all the armor she had wrapped around her heart, crumbled in an instant, and what was left was just a mother looking at her child. Then she looked past Elena's shoulder and saw the enormous, scarred, one-eyed dragon standing in the corridor behind her, hunched over and crammed into a space half his size, his sigils glowing softly in the dim light. Maria smiled, a broken, beautiful, defiant smile that made Elena's heart ache and soar at the same time. "Took you long enough, old lizard." Corvathis lowered himself to the ground, slowly, carefully, with a reverence that his warriors had never seen him show to anyone. The most feared dragon in the galaxy knelt before a frail human woman in a prison cell, and his voice, when it came, was thick with 40 years of silence and regret. "Forgive us, Ithkari. We should have come sooner." An alarm screamed through the facility. The Thessari Compact had launched a counterattack, but not against the dragons on the surface. They had turned their weapons on the human flotilla in orbit, targeting the civilian ships. It was a desperate, vindictive move designed to punish the humans for their defiance. Maria heard the alarm, read the situation on the tactical display mounted on the wall, and spoke with a voice that was thin from 6 years of disuse, but carried more authority than any general Elena had ever heard. "Protect my people," she said to Corvathis. "I will walk out on my own 2 feet." The Drakerin fleet moved like a living wall of fire between the Thessari weapons and the human ships. Corvathis had given the order from the surface the moment Maria spoke, and the 300 warships pivoted with a speed and coordination that defied their enormous size. They spread their formation wide, placing their armored hulls between the incoming Thessari barrage and the fragile collection of cargo haulers, medical frigates, and jury-rigged transports that had followed them across the galaxy. The Thessari missiles struck Dracaran shields instead of human steel, and the shields held. They had been built to withstand the kind of weapons that cracked moons, and the Thessari barrage splashed against them like rain against a mountain. The Dracaran did not fire back immediately. They simply absorbed the punishment, shielding the humans behind them. And then Corvathis gave a second order from the surface, in a voice that carried across every Dracaran command channel like rolling thunder. The warships fired once, a single, synchronized volley from 300 ships that lit up the void like a second sun. And the Thessari defense fleet broke apart, not destroyed, but shattered as a fighting force. Ships scattered in every direction, their formations ruined, their weapons silenced, their will to fight extinguished in the space of a single heartbeat. Every channel in the galaxy carried the footage. Cameras on the human ships, Dracaran battle sensors, neutral observation satellites, and a dozen news drones that had arrived in the system to cover what was quickly becoming the most watched event in living memory. All of them captured the same image from slightly different angles. 300 Dragon warships, the most powerful military force in known space, arranged in a protective shell around a ragged fleet of human civilian vessels. The ancient protecting the fragile, the mighty shielding the small. Fire wrapped around a collection of sparks to keep them burning. The image would become the most reproduced visual in galactic history. It would be painted on walls and projected on screens and taught in schools for centuries to come, and every species that saw it would understand the same thing. The Dracaran had not gone to Viros 3 to conquer. They had gone to repay a debt, and in doing so, they had shown the galaxy what humanity meant to them. On the surface, Maria Vargas walked out of the detention facility under her own power. She was slow, her legs were weak from years of confinement, and she had to stop twice to catch her breath. But she walked. Elena was on one side of her, and Corvathis on the other, and the old dragon had shrunk his stride to match hers, each of his steps careful and measured, so that he never moved faster than the small human woman beside him. Behind them, the 12 Ashborn warriors fell into formation, not a combat formation, but an honor guard, the kind reserved for the greatest heroes of their species. Their sigils blazed in the dim light of the Viros 3 sky, and the sound of their synchronized footsteps echoed across the empty compound like a drumbeat. Maria squinted up at the sky as they emerged into the open air, and she saw the Dracaran fleet hanging above them, hundreds of massive shapes blotting out the stars, and behind them, smaller and dimmer, but just as numerous, the human ships. "Elena," she said, and her voice cracked. "Are those—" "Humans," Elena said. "They came for you. They all came for you." Maria stopped walking. She stood in the open air of a world she had never wanted to see again, and looked up at the sky full of ships and pressed her hand to her mouth. The Ashborn sigil on her shoulder, faded after years without sunlight, dimmed by neglect and malnutrition and time, flickered once and then began to glow again, softly at first, and then brighter, like a coal that someone had finally breathed life back into. Corvathis saw it, and made the sound again, the deep, resonant hum that Elena had heard on the station, the one that vibrated through her bones. It was not a word, she realized now. It was a Dracaran expression of something they rarely felt, and had no proper name for. Something close to what humans called reverence. The fleet fired its engines in unison as Maria stepped onto the shuttle, that would carry her to safety. 300 warships, igniting their drives in the traditional Ashbourne salute, a roar of power and light that shook the atmosphere of Viros 3 and turned the sky white. It was a sound like a star being born, and it was the highest honor the Dracorin could bestow. The aftermath came swiftly. The Thessaly Compact faced galactic condemnation on a scale that their diplomats had never imagined possible. The footage of Mireya's imprisonment, the tiny cell, the inadequate food, the years without trial, was broadcast alongside the footage from Kethera 9. And the contrast between how she had treated the Dracorin and how the Thessaly had treated her made every species in the galaxy reconsider what they thought they knew about justice. Formal investigations were launched. Treaties were rewritten. The officials who had ordered Mireya's detention were removed from power and put on trial themselves. The laws governing the treatment of humans in contested space were overhauled, and for the first time in galactic history, humanity was recognized not as a minor species to be tolerated, but as a people to be respected. The Dracorin High Council, forced by the public exposure of the Kethera 9 records to acknowledge what Mireya had done, issued a formal declaration that stunned the galaxy. They opened the Ashbourne Order to non-Dracorin applicants for the first time in their civilization's history. The tests were brutal, the standards were impossibly high, and the training was designed for bodies far larger and stronger than any human possessed. Humans signed up by the thousands. They failed in droves. The physical demands alone were enough to break most candidates before the first month was over. But they kept coming, kept trying, kept showing up with broken bones and torn muscles, and the same impossible stubbornness that Mireya had carried through the fires of Kethera 9. Mireya herself retired to a quiet colony world called New Andalusia, where the sun was warm, and the air smelled like the sea she remembered from Earth. Elena visited her every week, and they sat together on a porch that overlooked a valley of green fields, and talked about everything and nothing, the way mothers and daughters do when they have been given back the time they thought they had lost. Mireya never spoke publicly about what had happened. She gave no interviews, wrote no memoirs, and refused every honor that was offered to her. When asked why, she would simply shrug and say that she had not done anything special. She had just done what needed doing, and anyone would have done the same. Nobody who knew her believed that, but nobody argued with her either. A rotation of Ashbourne warriors was always stationed near her home, not as guards, because Mireya would never have tolerated being guarded, but as family. They came in pairs, staying for a few weeks at a time before being replaced by others, and they spent their visits sitting on her porch, listening to her stories, learning to cook human food with claws that were never designed for kitchen work, and discovering that the woman who had saved their order was also someone who laughed easily, argued passionately about the proper way to grow tomatoes, and could beat any dragon at cards, because she had spent 40 years learning to read faces that most humans could not even look at. Elena did not go back to the Iron Nebula. She did not go back to wiping down counters and serving drinks to strangers. Instead, she traveled to the Dracorin homeworld and presented herself at the gates of the Ashbourne training grounds, a facility carved into the side of a volcano that had been burning for 10,000 years. She was the second human to ever attempt Ashbourne training. The first had been her mother, who had earned her place through circumstance and war. Elena intended to earn hers through choice. The training nearly killed her. Not once, but many times. She was too small, too slow, too fragile. She could not breathe fire, could not fly, could not take a hit from a Dracorin sparring partner without breaking something. The other candidates, all of them dragons, watched her struggle with expressions that ranged from pity to contempt. But she did not quit. She adapted. She found ways around every obstacle that her body could not go through. She used her size to go where dragons could not, her speed to strike where they could not reach, her mind to solve problems that brute strength could not touch. And slowly, painfully, one day at a time, she climbed. It took 3 years. 3 years of broken bones and sleepless nights, and moments where she lay on the ground, wondering if her mother's fire had skipped a generation. But on the day of the final trial, Elena stood before the Ashbourne Council, battered, scarred, breathing hard, and victorious. Corvathus was in the gallery. He sat among the council elders with the stillness of a mountain, and watched as the ceremonial ink was pressed into Elena's shoulder, the same shoulder where her mother bore the same mark. And the Ashbourne sigil took hold. But something was different. The sigil did not glow with the orange-white bioluminescence of the Dracoran. Instead, it ignited with a warm, steady golden light, the color of a sunrise, the color of honey, the color of something entirely new. The Dracoran in the chamber stared. They had never seen anything like it. Their marks burned with the color of fire, because fire was what they were, fierce and bright and consuming. But Elena's mark burned with a different kind of light, a human light, something that did not roar or flare, but simply shone, constant and unwavering. A young Dracoran sitting beside Corvathus leaned toward the old warrior and whispered, "Why does her light look different from ours?" Corvathus watched Elena standing among the Ashbourne, with the golden sigil glowing on her shoulder, and the same fierce, quiet fire in her eyes that her mother had carried across the battlefields of Cathara 9. And he smiled, a rare, slow, ancient expression that transformed his scarred face into something almost gentle. "Because they do not burn like us," he said. "We burn fast and bright, and consume everything we touch. But humans burn slow and steady. They burn like stars." He looked at Elena, this small, impossible, unbreakable human woman, standing tall among dragons. And his voice carried the weight of 40 years of gratitude and wonder, and something that his species had no word for, but that humans called love. "And stars, child, do not go out." The golden light on Elena's shoulder blazed brighter for just a moment, as if it had heard him, as if it agreed, and then it settled into its steady glow, warm and constant, a small sun burning in a room full of fire. And somewhere, on a quiet colony world beneath a warm sky, Maria Vargas sat on her porch and felt the old mark on her shoulder pulse with a sudden warmth that made her smile without knowing why. The way a mother's heart always knows, even across the distance of stars, when her child has become something extraordinary.